Welcome, everyone, to this discussion for parents and other adults who support teens. A new school year has just begun, of course, and the back to school transition is an especially big one for young people who are just beginning high school. So, tonight we're going to hear from a panel of experts who can help us understand what teens are going through physically, emotionally, and socially around those very difficult ages of 14 and 15. My name is Chris Bianchi, and on behalf of 9 News, I'm very pleased to help host this discussion in partnership with Colorado's Forward Together campaign. Also joining us tonight is Dr. Marie Banich, a neuroscientist who studies the teenage brain. She is the executive director of the Intermountain Neuroimaging Center at the University of Colorado Boulder. Dr. Michelle Rosenman is a clinical psychologist. She specializes in anxiety, depression, and related disorders in children and adolescents. She is an assistant professor of psychology and director of the Brave Lab in the University of Denver's Department of Psychology. And Emily Rivera is a high school counselor with nearly 20 years of experience in Colorado schools. She is currently at South High School in Denver. And for everyone joining us online, if you've got questions, well, we're going to try and get to some of those answers. You can drop those questions and comments for our panelists into the comments section. We're going to save a little time at the end of our discussion to try and get to as many of those questions as possible. Now, after the discussion, if you need to run out and get a snack, you miss 5 minutes or so, that's okay. This full video will be available at forwardtogetherco.com. And there's also, by the way, going to be a lot of good information you can find there for advice on ways to strengthen your relationship with the teens in your life. So research shows that teens, by the way, who feel connected are healthier and happier, and a strong connection with a parent or an adult can make a big difference. So with that all said, let's begin tonight with Dr. Banich to learn a little bit more about the teenage brain specifically. So Dr. Banich, would you mind sharing with us a little bit about what the teenage brain looks like at 14 or 15 years old and how it might impact the way that a young person acts?
Sure, Chris, thank you. Well, it's a really interesting time. As you said, it's a time of transition. And in some ways, teenagers at 14 to 15 are really starting that transition into adulthood. Some of the basic mental abilities that we think of adults having are really starting to blossom. So teenagers can do logic problems. If A equals B and B equals C, then A must equal C, and things of that nature. And so that means that sometimes they actually seem quite adult-like. But then, as all parents know, at some other times, they just seem like you're wondering what in the world were they thinking, or that they're really not as old as they think they are. There's 2 interesting things going on in the teen brain, which we now know is a very dynamic period of brain development. First, a lot of the centers in the frontal lobes, which are important for independent behavior, for judgment and decision-making, for controlling inhibition, for guiding one's behavior in a purposeful manner, are really starting to blossom. But we also know that we used to think that these areas developed by 18 or 19, but now we know it's really protracted into the early 20s. So in that sense, 14 and 15-year-olds are still more to the child end of the spectrum than the adult end of the spectrum. Complicating things, one of the things that scientists have discovered is that around 14 to 16, there's a peak in activity in reward centers in the brain, much more so in this period of the teens than either in childhood or adulthood. And this reward system in the brain has an interesting characteristic. That characteristic is that it is extremely responsive to new experiences that are rewarding, to unexpected rewards. Now, we as adults may appreciate this somewhat. If you think about the first time you kissed your spouse or significant other, it was thrilling, it was unexpected. But by the time you got to the 10,000th kiss, you knew exactly what you were going to get. And the reward system in your brain, quite frankly, was bored at that point. And this is a system that's very active in teenagers. So what does that mean? That means a lot of the family activities you've done previously that they enjoyed may now seem boring. They're not new and exciting. They know exactly what Friday night pizza is going to be like, or whatever your family tradition might be. So they're going to seek out new experiences. And that's just part of what this stage of life is about. Now, of course, what we need to do as parents and educators and professionals is to try to help teens have these new experiences in a way that they don't get themselves into trouble or detrimental. But it's an important part of the developmental phase, that is seeking out new experiences and learning how to adapt and take on more adult roles.
Really valuable insight. Thank you so much, Dr. Banish. Now let's hear from Dr. Michelle Rosamond for some insight into the psychological and emotional changes teens are going through at about the time, right around when they start high school. So Dr. Rosamond, what are some of those top things that you think parents should know about this part of their teens' development?
Thank you, Chris. So as Dr. Banish described, there are lots of brain changes that we cannot see with the naked eye. What we can notice is how teens behave and, to a degree, what they think and what they feel. So let's talk about behavior first. There are two types of behaviors that we tend to see during this transitional adolescent period. And while they seem opposite, they can actually happen at the same time. The first behavior we see is this approach that's already been described. So this is approach toward novelty or risk, to new experiences, to things teens previously were not allowed to do before, maybe to things they're still not allowed to do, but their friends are doing. Maybe things like wanting to drive before they've actually practiced, doing things that test those limits of independence that parents are setting. Again, these approach behaviors, sometimes towards risk, happen as teens start to pursue more independence and also as they're exposed to new people. The opposite of approach is avoidance or withdrawal. And this is when a teen doesn't do things that we might want them to do or that they have to do. So you might see procrastination in assignments to the point where a teen might get a little behind, or attempting to get out of things that are new challenges, like giving a presentation for the first time in front of a new 9th grade class. You might also see withdrawal from prior friendships or from family members. Teens may want to spend more time alone in their room or pursue new friendships, potentially ones that parents don't necessarily enjoy, or that they're surprised that the teen has kind of dropped some of their old friends and is pursuing new friends. In terms of cognition, or how teens think, we're seeing an increase in abstract thinking skills. In some ways, this is fantastic. Teens are starting to problem solve and think through hypothetical situations, but simultaneously, they may develop a long-term goal, like I want a car, without an actual plan or steps to get there, or realization that there need to be plan or steps to get to that big goal. Teens may also start to try to figure out where they belong in their social world. So do my peers like me? Why have my friendships changed? Where do I fit in my social group? Where do I fit in my family or my broader community? And these questions, what's happening here is that teens are starting to recognize that there's a much bigger world around them, and they're trying to situate themselves in it, while they're simultaneously starting to develop some, but not all, abstract thinking. The intensity of emotions also change. So teens can be really enthusiastic and excited for these novel experiences, and simultaneously they can have these other fluctuations in their mood where they're feeling really sad or angry, sometimes without a recognition of why that's happening. These fluctuations can be frustrating for both the teens and the parents themselves. So one minute your teen's laughing at a TikTok video and the next they snap at you because you've told them to sit down for dinner. Importantly, teens may not realize that these fluctuations are happening, and they may also not recognize what is triggering them if specific events are causing those fluctuations. And again, these changes to thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are all about the teen's brain developing, but also that their environment is changing. And as both of those things are happening, they're trying to move toward independence and figure out how they fit in their broader home, school, and social worlds.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Rosamond. And before we get to questions, by the way, for those of you joining us today, we did want to bring in some perspective from Emily Rivera, who I mentioned earlier. She's an experienced high school counselor. She helps teens navigate through the social, emotional, and academic challenges that they face in high school. So Ms. Rivera, could you tell us a bit more about the challenges that are happening in the school setting, especially for new freshmen?
Sure, Chris. And as you just heard, teens are going through all kinds of brain changes, changes with their emotions and behavior. And then we throw them in a salad spinner that is high school. Usually kids are in a bigger environment. Traditionally high schools are grade 9 through 12. So it's a transition year. They're exposed to a greater variety of classes than they may have had in middle school or elementary school, where they have some autonomy over, do I want to take drawing or do I want to take engineering? And having that voice in their experience and what they're learning is really important. Likewise with their social setting and who they're spending time with and who they're making friends with, that also increases. You get kids from all these different middle schools, and it's a whole new salad, if you will, of choices of people to spend time with. And that can be pretty overwhelming. In general, I talk to parents about high school really being that shift towards independence, and it's a spectrum, right? And I use an analogy that I learned from a dear mentor of mine that you can think of the high school years as kind of like a tandem bicycle. And when kids are little, parents put on their helmet and make sure they're all, tucked in and safe. And ninth grade is a little bit like that. If you use the tandem bicycle analogy, that the parents are doing a lot of the steering and they're doing a lot of the pedaling. Teachers are still really involved in doing that pedaling and steering. And then our goal during high school is to shift to where the teenagers, the students themselves are doing the steering and the pedaling, and having more choice over what they're studying, who they're spending time with, what their values are and who they are. And then eventually, by the time, students graduate, sometimes we have to tell mom and dad, it's time to get off the bike, right? Your kid is ready to start making these choices for themselves. In classes, we see that a lot with, if a student is starting to struggle in class, parents oftentimes want to reach out directly to the teacher, which is great. I encourage you to stay involved in what's happening in school. But it's also an opportunity to empower students and teach them to advocate for themselves. How do you write an email to a teacher, or how do you have that conversation with them if they are struggling? Another big change to make sure that parents and students are aware of in high school is that they're starting to build their permanent record for the future, that the grades that they're earning in their classes are different than they were in middle school and in elementary school. They're earning credits, they're building their grade point average that they'll use to apply to colleges down the road. And that is important because the students who maybe make some mistakes and earn an F, that can be a flaw in their transcript, and that can be devastating to students. I also remind parents and students that there's a balance, right? That we put pressure on students to do amazing things, and there's going to be some stumbles along the way, and that includes academically and socially, and we support them with that compassionate landing spot and help them navigate those different challenges that do pop up.
Well, thank you so much, Ms. Rivera, for that answer. And now we're going to move on to some questions. And just as a reminder, that if you do have a question for us, and if you're joining us online, drop it into the comment section. We're going to try and get to as many of those as possible. For simplicity reasons, I'm going to go in the same order we just went in. So Dr. Banich, then Dr. Rosamond, then Ms. Rivera. We're going to go in that order. So with this panel question, I'm going to start things off by asking you, Dr. Banich, first to you, and then again to Dr. Rosamond, and then Ms. Rivera. Dr. Banich, why is this time in their lives important for future development and for future opportunities?
Well, I think it's really important because as we've heard, this is a time where children are turning into teens and then transitioning over into adults. In terms of brain development, it's a time when new connections are being made and new ways of thinking about the world. And as we've heard, abstract thought and things of that nature. So what's going to happen during this time period is some of these patterns are going to get laid down, which then can be used and built upon as teens basically transition into adulthood. We know that there's certain things that you can actually do to help the teen brain in this time period. Matter of fact, we're fortunate here at Colorado to be one of the sites of a large national study, the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, supported by the National Institute of Health. That's really trying to get at this question of how is brain development changing during this time period. The study's been going on for a little while. We're a little less than halfway through, but it's been showing interesting factors that may influence and help brain development. For example, in the initial results suggest that even at this age, getting exercise is good. It helps. Get out, take a walk, be involved in sports. Getting exercise is helpful. Also, we know that this is a time where there's a big change in sleep cycles, where it's shifting towards a pattern of staying up later. So good, what scientists call sleep hygiene, getting up and going to sleep at a similar time, can also help the brain, because it turns out that during sleep is when memories are formed. A lot of memories are formed during sleep. So it's important for teenagers to get some sleep, although they might want to stay up late and do something new and novel.
Dr. Rosamond?
I agree with all of that, and I'm a big fan of the ABCD study. One of the things we've been learning from psychosocial research about how teens develop and what's really good for their emotional development is to talk about and practice stress management skills. So we all have various stress management skills, and then a stressor happens and our skills go out the window. So one of the best things we can do is to practice those skills when we're in a place of calm, when things are relatively stable, there's not a new transition, and then try to then practice those skills after the fact when a transition like the start of a new school year is happening. We liken this in our work to practicing a sport before the actual game, right? So we always practice before we implement. And many of these stress management skills are things that parents can find free online and teens can access free online. Things like practicing how to relax one's body, for example, before bed or before a test. Things like how to challenge some of those stressed or worry thoughts that we experience before we try something new. And things like taking a slow and step-by-step approach toward big things that scare us that we haven't done before.
And over to Ms. Rivera as well.
And I love that you brought up the importance of self-care and parents modeling that and practicing that with students. I think building on that would be what some people refer to as the soft skills or career readiness skills, that as important as learning the math and the reading and the writing skills, students are learning problem solving, they're learning teamwork, they're learning that self-advocacy. And then a 14 or a 15-year-old certainly doesn't need to know what they want to be when they grow up and what career they want to go into and have it all mapped out. They can't, from what we're hearing about the brain research, but it's important to encourage them to be curious and start to really look at what are their interests and what are their skills, what are they good at, so that they are connecting their everyday learning, whether it's at school, at home, in the community, with that future planning. Because the next 4 years, they're laying the groundwork, whether it's through grades and transcripts or volunteer work or clubs and activities, for what comes next after high school.
Thanks so much for all those great answers. Moving on to our next question. Again, we'll go in the same order. Starting with you, Dr. Banich. I think this is a question a lot of parents really do grapple with, is we all want success for our kids, right? We want them to succeed in school. We want them to succeed in sports, socially, in virtually every aspect. But how do you do that without creating undue stress or creating anxiety for your child? Dr. Banich, to you.
Well, one of the things that's interesting, if you go back to the brain sciences, remember I told you that the frontal lobes are important for planning. We've been discussing this. And so what happens is those areas of the brain have to develop. So if you throw someone into the deep end of the pool, it could raise anxiety, it could be stressful. So I think what we know about the frontal lobes is that they are important when novel situations come up. And one can start to train an individual to think about that. So often scientists talk about scaffolding, and teachers do too. That is to give a teen a little bit of an experience in a way that they can handle in a safe environment. And then as they acquire that skill, raising the bar a little bit. So I'll give a concrete example. If you think about teen drivers, initially, when they start to drive, they're in a car with an adult who has experience, and in some senses, their surrogate frontal lobe sitting next to them, saying, "Ooh, you went into that intersection too quickly," or "Hey, you got to look both ways before you do that." Something of that nature, so that they're learning skills, but it's in a safe environment. And then as they get better, then the adult leaves the car and they can drive by themselves, but not with friends and a high degree of stimulation and distraction. And once they have that down, then they move on to driving independently. So it's really about taking this in a stepwise manner. So as their brain develops and can have better capabilities, they also have the experiences that go along with that to allow them to transition into an adult role.
Fascinating. Dr. Rosamond?
One of the biggest reminders I give to both teens and parents, and this isn't just me, the science shows it, is that a little bit of stress is actually important and really good for all of us. A little bit of stress is what gets us to respond to the alarm clock in the morning and get to work or school on time. It's what gets us to look both ways before we cross the street, study for a test in advance of the test. And during adolescence in particular, a little bit of stress is expected because so many things are new and the teen hasn't done them before, right? And if we think about ourselves when we were teens, we would get a bit nervous or a bit stressed the very first time we did something. So one of the major things that parents can work on with their teens is coming up with ways that the teens can take those small steps in a way that the teen feels inspired, motivated, and ready to take on the plan. And for those of you parents that have tried to do things for your teen, like solve the problem for them or take the small steps for them, that doesn't work very well. So having conversations when your teen is calm and not stressed about the situation, trying to figure out what small step or two your teen can take, and then how you might support them in taking that step makes it much more likely that your teen will then follow through. And then we were talking about rewards earlier. Guess what? After that teen has taken a step or two, maybe a reward that they want, something that you can pair to get their mood boosted, to get them feeling a little bit more confident. That pairing between taking the step and then getting that reward actually makes it more likely that the teen will plan and take a step in the future.
And over to you, Ms. Rivera.
I would add that Dr. Banich talked about the scaffolding that's so important. That's true for academic skills too, that with that increase in rigor and different classes and levels of classes, many students have never had to organize themselves, or they've never had to organize their own time. So you'll get some eye rolls and maybe some pushback if you say to your student, hey, let's set up your folders and whatever it might be, but it's important to model that and encourage students to come up with their system that's going to work for them, because it will relieve some stress and anxiety down the road. And then I also just want to remind parents and students the importance of realistic expectations and not putting too much stress on students to overperform. I think a lot of our students are so stressed about needing to get the best grades possible and do all of the sports and all of the extracurricular activities. And they get so many messages that their every choice and action starting right away is going to be a make or break for the rest of their lives. And whether that's something that they're putting on themselves or something that is being, coming from them externally, they feel a lot of pressure. So I always want to remind students and parents that you're more than your GPA, that your self-worth is not summed up in a test score. Very few adults would look back on their high school experience and be able to tell you how many AP classes they took. It's about the relationships that they built and the experiences that they had. So giving your students some room do not take on all of that stress, I think is really important to remind them.
That's good advice there. And kind of speaking of that, now we've kind of touched on this, but maybe more specifically, and again, I'll go to you first, Dr. Banich, then Dr. Roseman, then Ms. Rivera. What are some of those specific sources of stress that you're typically noticing in 14, 15-year-olds?
Well, I think we've discussed some of them already. I think it's really about this transition. The world is changing in a very drastic way. Peer relationships become much more important. So who am I vis-a-vis my peers? Where do I stand in the world? How should I act? Am I cool? And then the expectations of basically being judged about your performance. Your academic record's going to be important for where you go on from here. So I think that those all create a difficult situation. I think the other thing I'd like to follow up on what has been said earlier is there's a way in which parents can help, and that is to really try to talk to their teen to see what they are thinking. Okay, so often parents will just say, oh, well, did you do this or did you do that? And the teen will give a very, brief answer. But really talking through how would you deal with this situation? So let me make this a little bit more concrete. You might say to your teen, if you ever get at a party or situation you don't want, call me, I'll come get you, or something of that nature. And most teens, because they don't have the same planning ability, if they got in that situation, they're probably going to be like, oh, I can't call my parents. What are all my friends going to say? I can't do that. So having these conversations beforehand and talking to them about this pre-planning that Dr. Roseman talked about a little bit. What would you do in this stressful situation? What would you feel comfortable? How could you leave this social situation in a way that you wouldn't lose face? And really helping them to create a plan that works for them and going from there. And then they almost have that in their toolbox, if you will, should that situation arise. Because their ability, the frontal lobes aren't totally developed, the ability to make up that plan on the fly probably isn't going to be too good. And it's not going to be too good if they're in a stressful or emotionally charged situation.
And Dr. Roseman, I'll go over to you for this one as well.
Yes, so some of the research data from our colleagues, both here at the University of Denver and at CU Boulder, suggests that teens are still taking lots of cues from their parents, even as they're maybe trying to distance a bit. So especially in an unprecedented and very stressful world event like we're all experiencing now, teens may be hearing and starting to kind of integrate some of the things they hear their parents and aunts and uncles and grandparents and neighbors saying, and they may start to worry about them a little bit, even though they don't necessarily have the full worldview or all of the abstract thinking skills that would be necessary in order to help them feel like, okay, my parents are supporting us, we've got this, we're gonna do what we can do to manage our family's life. And so one of the best things that parents can do is leave open lines of communication with their teen, not just when the teen looks or acts like they're stressed, but all of the time. And to elicit their teen's opinions and ideas and interests, in addition to eliciting from them, oh, it seems like this was a rough week at school. You want to talk about it? Should we get ice cream and then talk about it, right? The most important thing that parents can do to understand their teen's stress, in addition to leaving that line of communication open, is to ask about it when their teen is not acutely stressed or irritable. So to ask about it when their teen is feeling calm and when the family is either enjoying time together or when everything's kind of, the teen is feeling level-headed and cool and calm and collected.
Now, Ms. Rivera, over to you as well.
I would add that teens are under a lot of stress, and it's the typical things like academics and social situations and being in high school. But now more than ever, I see that they are also carrying a huge societal burden, that they feel the stress of world events. They feel the stress of a global pandemic, of famine and refugee situations in other countries, that it's part of their development that they are more aware of what is going on beyond their little circle. And there's some real fear and anxiety around those things. So I think I would just encourage families to have conversations about that. We're seeing a lot of anxiety and even panic attack kind of feelings at school. After a year and a half of being away from school, we've all kind of gotten lax at our social skills. And being back in the mix and in a hallway with hundreds of other students, it's hard and it's a little overwhelming. And so giving ourselves as adults and also as kids some grace to say, okay, we're all dealing with something kind of new right now, and that's okay. Let's talk about it, and what do we need to do to make you feel comfortable on a daily basis.
It certainly feels difficult as an adult at times, to handle some of these things, let alone for a teenager. So certainly appreciate your insight on that. Just in the interest of time, just want to make sure we get to all these questions. Going to probably put this out to one of you, these following questions. So feel free to kind of chip on in here, Dr. Banich, Dr. Roseman, and Ms. Rivera. Just one of you, just if you don't mind taking each of these following questions. That way, again, just in the interest of time, that we can get to everything. With that in mind, when we talk about teenagers, we often focus on the challenges, but maybe kind of spinning things a bit more positively. What do you see as some of the more positive and exciting things that teens go through as they enter high school, and how parents can get involved and support some of those?
I'll jump in. I love this age group, and I've worked with teens my whole career. It's a time of a lot of hope and excitement because they are exploring not just what they like in the world, but what's important to them, what their values are, and starting to act on those and really decide for themselves what they want their identity to be and what they want to do in the future and that kind of thing. So it's a really exciting time of students' lives, and to see the progression from the time they come in as little 14-year-olds to the time they graduate is really amazing. I would just encourage parents, we've said this several times, but just to keep those lines of communication open. You're gonna get the eye rolls and the pushback because that's their independence talking. It's not you. It's developmentally appropriate for them to often think that you're the least cool person in the world, but your opinion does still matter. So keep asking those questions, set aside time where it's not like, let's sit down and talk about the important serious stuff right now. I liked the ice cream suggestion earlier. I had a good friend tell me that she gets the most out of her daughter when they go for a walk together, that it's a low risk situation, so that you can really talk to the students, talk to your kids about what's important to them and the kind of person they're becoming. And then the flip side of that is give them some space to make those choices and to become the person that they are, not who you want them to be necessarily. So giving them that space to not mirror your values all the time. Of course, your family's values are important and should be talked about, but they also get to come up with their own and have their own likes and their own interests. So that's part of what makes it such a fun age.
Well, certainly appreciate that. And again, just moving on here, would like to hear maybe some more insight about how teens form relationships with and maintain some of those relationships with their friends specifically. So a few questions kind of relating to that. And again, just if one person could take on these following questions. First one, out to our panels, what is different about this time and how teens form relationships and connect with the people around them?
I can take this one. We are in the digital age of social media. Things that we did not have ourselves are very, very salient and often the primary mode of communication between 14 and 15-year-olds today. And so while many of us used to have to call on a landline to set up a hangout with a friend or talk to them about it at school or after school, now they're constantly on their phones or other devices and able to communicate that way. both a really great thing because teens can connect with people that they otherwise really wouldn't connect with. They can feel connected from their own bedroom. It also can be concerning because the internet is a vast place and not everybody necessarily has the best intentions, and teens may not recognize that because they themselves have good intentions. So again, keeping those lines of communication open and knowing who your teen is talking to by asking and by hoping that they share, and by always leaving that door open for them to let you know who they're communicating with and how they're building those relationships. The other way that relationships start to shift and change is that teens can make fast and furious friends very, very quickly with somebody at the start of a school year or in a new class, or because they had a particular experience. And then just as quickly that relationship can fizzle because they found somebody else who's new and exciting and interesting, or more like them, or has more common interests. So we do see some fluctuation in the various friendships that teens have. That in and of itself is not necessarily concerning, but if your teen has stopped spending time with any friends and they used to be really social, that may be a time that you may want to chat with them and see what's going on.
Another question out to our panel. Can you share your thoughts here on the importance of relationships for teens? How important are they, and what parents should do or not do if they're concerned about the influence of some of those friends? It's a tricky one. I'll put that as the panel.
I think we've heard a little bit about the research behind part of that independence that teens are moving towards is that their peer group becomes more important to them than their parent group, and that's perfectly normal. I would encourage parents to give your child space to do that. And to spend time with their friends rather than clamping down on that and saying, no, well, family time is important, but just knowing that that is developmentally appropriate, that they're going to want to spend that time with peers, and that their peers' opinions are going to feel more important than their family's opinions a lot of times.
Interesting. Even though teens spend a lot of time, obviously, around others their age at school, many teens still tend to feel loneliness. I think it's something we're all fairly aware of. Can you tell us more about this challenge for teens and what parents should watch for and how they can help if their teen is experiencing that, or you perceive them to be experiencing that? I'll put that out against the panel.
You know, when parents raise this to me, I say to them, well, did you never feel lonely as a teen, even if you had social relationships? And even though your parent might have been saying to you, you have friends and a peer group that, you know, enjoy spending time with you. That loneliness is in part related to those fluctuations in mood that we see, that trying to figure out where I fit in my social group and maybe feeling awkward or maybe like I don't fit in. So those feelings in and of themselves are normal. The thing that we want to make sure for teens in terms of resilience and healthy development is that those feelings don't get in the way of their attempts to pursue friendships, their spending time with the friends that they do have, and their attempts to engage in other activities that could involve a social component. So the treatment research, when we're working on how to help teens be resilient and how to help parents support teens, really suggests that, again, open lines of communication, we've heard this several times before, but that parents really validate both that feeling of loneliness and support the teen pursuing social interactions, which may help them feel more connected.
All right, well, we'll certainly appreciate that on the topic of friends, which of course we know is very important when it comes to teenagers. Another thing that probably concerns, especially parents, but of course teenagers as well, is as teens become more independent and they start making more choices for themselves, parents often worry about whether or not they will make good choices, especially when it comes to drinking, smoking, using marijuana, or even having healthy sexual relationships. So again, this goes out to the panel here. What should parents know about access to alcohol and other substances these days? And what are common challenges that you might be seeing or noticing in schools?
I would say, and do say to parents, that if a student is seeking that influence, they're going to find it. And that's not to say that every high school is a perfectly clean place and that nobody's doing drugs or alcohol. It's there, and if their teens are looking for that, they're going to find it. I also think that the example that parents set at home is really important. So looking at alcohol and drug use in your own home, and is it something that you talk about with your kids, and what limits are you setting? I think that's a really important component to it, but I definitely would defer to the clinical side of things and would want to hear what the doctors have to say about that too.
Speaking of which, Dr. Banich, can you tell us more specifically about the effect of substance use on the teenage brain?
Yeah, I think actually that's something that our ABCD study is trying to look at. It's really trying to get an idea of a number of questions. So obviously, drug use, alcohol ingestion at high levels is not going to be good for the teenage brain, because it's an area in which the time in which there's a lot of development going on. But we know, as Ms. Rivera said, that if youth want to experiment, they're going to. So I think the more important question that we're trying to get a handle on is how much is too much, right? And also, are there particular times during development where it's particularly deleterious to be experimenting with substances? There's some work that's been done in mice that suggests, for example, ingesting certain substances right around puberty can have lifelong effects. So I think the total answer isn't really clear yet, but it's one of the things that scientists are looking at. I think the other thing I'd like to add that I think is important for parents to know is, first of all, I was talking about those reward centers in the brain, and peers will make them fire, okay? New experiences will make them fire, but we see activation when they're in a social group. It's very rewarding to teens. And so that transition away from focus on family to their peers is really part of development. There's something else about the reward system that's important. I said earlier that the reward system in the brain is really active. And I think that has important implications for how parents deal with these difficult issues. If their teen starts to do things that they prefer they didn't. The research basically suggests that teens are much more impervious, much more likely to ignore punishment, that what is really going to motivate them are rewards. And I think Dr. Rosenman talked about that earlier. So although you may be very annoyed and thinking that restricting their activities is the way to go, their brains are going to be more sensitive to rewards when they act in the ways that you would like them to, rather than punishing them when they act in ways you would prefer they didn't.
Dr. Banich, since you just touched on this, I'm going to put this out to either Ms. Rivera or Dr. Roseman. If you do find out that your teen is using substances, what should you do? Of course, that's a top question for many parents' minds.
When we work with parents and teens, particularly in the realm of communicating around things that the teen has done that the parent is not particularly happy with, whether it's drugs or alcohol, risky other behaviors, or just breaking rules, the question for the family is really, what are the rules and what can you help your teen do, both in terms of rewards and incentives, but also in terms of making the rewards seem, the rules or whatever you want your teen to do seem more appealing to your teen so that they are more likely to participate. Sometimes when teens and parents have conflict about things like drugs and alcohol, it isn't logical, everybody's heated, and so that doesn't lead to a productive discussion about why the parent might be concerned about what the teen is doing and who they're with and how that particular behavior may not be dangerous or might get them into trouble. Whereas if everybody feels calm and is ready to have that conversation, then the teen may be more likely to listen. The parent may also be more likely to listen to the teen. And even if they disagree, hear the teen out about why they prefer or want to engage in particular behaviors. So I've said this several times before, but having these kinds of very serious discussions about topics that can get intense really should happen when everybody is ready to have the discussion and feels prepared and calm and knows it's coming.
Well, I guess a final panel question for everyone out there is how do teens explore and establish their own identity? Obviously, that's such a key part of adolescence. And how do adults participate in that, or should they even participate in that? And if so, I guess, how do they go about that? And again, there'll be somebody on the panel, one of you feels strongly about the subject, one of you wouldn't mind taking that question.
I see students, and I mentioned this earlier, that they are shifting from what they like to what they value. So they're exploring not just their interests in music and fashion, those sorts of things, but the kind of people they want to be around and the kind of person they want to be. And the fastest way, I think, for a parent to alienate their student is to judge that person that they are exploring and wanting to try on to see how it fits. So that would be one of my big pieces of advice to parents, is to listen first to understand and avoid those judgments as you see your student exploring, whether it is fashion and hairstyles or piercings or gender identity and sexual identity is another big one that parents may not feel comfortable with their students starting to explore who they are, but coming down with a quick judgment or belittling your child or their friends is pretty much a surefire way to shut down those lines of communication that are so important at this age.
I'm going to get into some individual questions for our panel before we start to wrap things up here on this Thursday night. First of all, back to you, Ms. Rivera, and how can adults ask about what's going on in school? I know you kind of touched on this a few times already, but how can they specifically ask about what's going on in school, and what do adults need to know about intervening or not in any academic or social issues? And again, I know you just touched on that, but if you wouldn't mind maybe elaborating a bit more on that.
Sure. I think it's helpful for parents to know just enough that they can ask some directed open-ended questions. So instead of just saying, how was your day at school? You're going to get a pretty short answer. Fine, right? Okay. But if you are able to, whether it's through the school management system, we use something called Schoology, getting on there with your student and having them be the expert and you're the novice. Take me through your classes. Tell me about what you're doing in English. How was your math test? What do you think you're going to write your paper about? Having some of those more specific things to ask about that shows your interest and gives your student a chance to really shine and be the expert is a way to get at the academics. And socially, similarly, if they went to the football game on Friday night, who'd you sit with? What's something funny that happened? And really just keeping those lines of communication open. As far as intervening, I go back to the tandem bicycle analogy that early on, parents may need to intervene a little bit more, especially if it's a safety concern, always if it's a safety concern. But as a student gets older, I think it's important that parents and us as educators empower kids to advocate for themselves and to work on brainstorming how to fix the problem, how to communicate with the people they need to communicate with, whether it's socially or academically, to resolve the issue that they're having. Because mom or dad's not always going to be around to intervene. So it's important that those kids are starting to develop those skills.
No doubt about that. And Dr. Roseman, this is one specifically for you. If your teen is not communicating with you directly, if they aren't open to conversation, which we know never happens, what can adults do in that situation? And what are some things to watch for that may signal that a teenager may need help?
Yes, so we've all kind of mentioned some of these things about keeping the lines of communication open about the fun things, the good things, as well as the things that might be potential sources of stress or difficult new experiences. Sometimes it also takes a slightly different approach. So having this stance of, I'm here whenever you need me, whenever you want to talk. I'm going to keep pestering and asking you because I'm your parent and I love you, and you can keep rolling your eyes at me and maybe even poking a little bit of fun at yourself will lighten the mood a little bit and allow your teen to remember that if they do have something they might need to speak about. The other thing that we see happening is teens often, and I'll speak for myself as a teen, this happened for me, teens often feel like they are experiencing all these things for the very first time that nobody has ever experienced before. And my experience is so unique. And simultaneously, parents are thinking, well, I've been through all of that. And I have the answers now that I'm older and a little bit wiser, and I can guide you through it. But teens aren't necessarily ready to hear that because their experience is so unique to them because they really are experiencing it for the first time. So taking the time to really let your teen tell you without you necessarily telling them what they should be doing can really open up those lines of communication. In terms of warning signs that your teen may need a little bit of additional support, if your teen has started to change their behavior, so they're starting to avoid or withdraw from the things that they have to do, like school assignments, as well as the things they want to do or used to like to do, like spending time with peers, doing their athletics, playing their instrument, even doing their social media things. If they've started to look more down, or you're feeling like they used to be happy and they don't seem as happy as they used to be, or you're hearing a lot of negative self-talk to the point where your teen is getting to the point where they can't think of a single thing they like about themselves or that they're good at, that might be a time to talk to a pediatrician. Colorado is an amazing state in that it also has a state-specific helpline. Not all states do, which is fantastic. And then in some cases, parents and teens will seek professional help from a licensed therapist or psychologist for a few months to teach the teen some skills so that they can get their stress management on track or address whatever the difficult situation is. And of course, families can always contact our research group, the Brave Lab at the University of Denver. We have pamphlets, resources, packets, web links, book recommendations that we're always happy to provide to families here.
By the way, that phone number, I'll read this again for you in just a few minutes. It is 844-493-8255. Again, that's 844-493-8255, just that phone number that you were referencing there, Dr. Rosenman. A couple more questions before we again begin to wrap things on up. Ms. Rivera, how can adults help teens explore career opportunities or future planning?
I think we need to give them lots of opportunities to be curious, right? Talk about your own job, talk about your own path through high school or post-secondary education, giving teens opportunities to talk with extended family, neighbors, just to see what is available and to hear about other people's experiences is a really great way to become career curious. And then also just doing a lot of reflection and letting your teen know what you see in them. You know, I think you're a really good listener. You know, have you ever thought about doing X, Y, or Z and pointing out what you see as their strengths is a really good place to start, especially early on when they're 14 or 15. Some kids know laser-like exactly what they want to do. And we all know as adults that oftentimes that changes, and that's okay. But helping them to become aware of what their different options are and exploring those is a great place to start.
Dr. Banch, we'll finish with you, at least in terms of individual questions. What is good for a teenager's brain, and what can we do to help them with their brain's development?
Well, I think as we've talked about, there are certain things you can do physically. I think earlier I mentioned that getting exercise seems to be good. Also getting sleep, and also for parents to be aware that there really is this shift in the sleep cycle. of the teen's brain. So it's just not that they're, being grumpy in the morning, that they don't want to get up. This sleep cycle really does shift to a later rising time than is typical for adults, and to staying up later. And that often then, when they're put on this clock that really doesn't suit their brain during the work week, during the school week, and the parental work week, that then they're going to try to catch up on the weekends. So they just may want to sleep. And it's not that they're being lazy or they're trying to avoid you or things of that nature. So I think from the physical end, those are things that that can be helpful. And then I think, as we've all emphasized, this is a time of exploration and learning and finding ways to support that, to support their curiosity. Even, maybe they like soccer and you love baseball or something like that, supporting them in soccer. And then one of the other things I think that's interesting is it's easy to forget as an adult how, I think, confusing the world can be for a teen. You have a lot of experiences that they don't have, but more than that, you have your particular area of expertise, what you're good at. I think if you want to empathize with them, you can start to do something you've never done before, that you haven't thought about. And so it could be picking up a new sport or trying a language or just something. And I think it's a way to really realize what they're up against, because as adults, we get competent in what we do and we stay there because it feels good. And because we don't have to feel all that insecurity. So maybe, you and your teen both take up something new together and put you in a better place to empathize with them and what they're going through, and probably help their brain and your brain at the same time.
So interesting advice there, Dr. Banich. Well, we are almost out of time, unfortunately, for this discussion, but there's one more important note for parents. If at any point you or your teen are struggling and you think you might need a bit more help, or even just want to talk to somebody about when or whether to seek professional support, remember that you can text or call Colorado Crisis Services. The website is coloradocrisisservices.org. Again, that's Colorado Crisis Services, all spelled out, .org. And you can call 844-493-8255. Again, 844-493-8255, or text TALK, T-A-L-K, to 38255. So hopefully a couple of resources there. And hopefully this past hour is giving you some really good insight to for the parents and caregivers out there. And mostly thanks to our expert panel, Dr. Marie Banich, Dr. Michelle Rosenman, and Emily Rivera. And I also want to remind our viewers to visit forwardtogetherco.com for other resources to help you better support your teen and build a stronger relationship with them. We hope that this will be a great school year. It's an interesting one, but hopefully it is a great one for the teens in your life. Thanks for joining us, and have a great rest of your night.